Les verbes réfléchis. So, why reflexive? What does that mean? Well, in English it means doing something back to ourselves. So, in English, an equivalent would be, I wash myself, I dress myself, you dress yourself, he dresses himself, she dresses herself, we dress ourselves, they dress themselves, and so on. So that's how we express it in English. In French, however, it's a little different. We have a reflexive pronoun and what are called reflexive verbs. For example, je me lave. So instead of I wash myself, we say I wash me. And of course the me bit, the reflexive pronoun, as with all pronouns, has to come before the verb. So you can see it comes before the verb, except in the affirmative imperative, and we'll talk about that later. In English, we can omit the pronoun, but we can never do this in French. For example, we can just say I wash, and we can tell from context that we mean ourselves, yeah. But in French, you can never drop this. You must always make it a reflexive verb, je me lave. So how do we form it? Well, let's take this reflexive verb to wash, se laver. And that is the reflexive pronoun that we use when we're talking about an infinitive, se laver. Je me lave, I wash me. Tu te laves, you wash you. Il, elle, on se lave. Nous, nous lavons. Vous, vous lavez. Il, elle se lave. And so these in red are what we call the reflexive pronouns, and they come before the verb. Me makes sense, te, se makes sense. You'll need to be careful though, nous lavons, vous lavez, because they're the same. This one here is a subject pronoun, and this one here is a reflexive pronoun, so they have different functions. So you need to remember that, vous lavez again, and then we're back to il, elle se lave. Here are some examples of how we can use reflexive pronouns, reflexive verbs to talk about our daily routine. Here are some really common ones. Se laver, to wash oneself. Se lever, to get oneself up, to wake up. Se réveiller, to wake up. Se lever is actually the act of getting yourself up. Yeah? Se coucher, to go to bed. S'endormir, to fall asleep. S'habiller, to dress oneself. Se doucher, to shower oneself. Se baigner, to bathe oneself. And you can see already in English, sometimes we'll use a pronoun, sometimes we'll never use a pronoun to go to bed. We never make that a reflexive verb in English. So you can see already that the French use reflexive verbs a lot more often. There you go. Many more reflexive verbs than in English. They'll even use them for things like s'arrêter, je m'arrête, I stop myself. Yeah? Whereas in English we'll just say I stop. They also have another use. In English we'll say something like I wash my hands. Now we know whose hands are being washed in English because we have this little personal adjective here, my hands. Yeah, I wash my hands. But in French they tackle it a different way. Je me lave les mains. I wash the hands to myself. And that's how they say it in French. I wash the hands to myself. So je me lave les mains. And because we know then whose hands are being washed because of the me, we only need to, we can just use a definite article there, les mains, the hands. Il se lave les cheveux. He washes the hairs. Remember in French, hair is just one single strand, so he washes the hairs to himself. Yeah, he washes his hair in English. Nous nous brossons les dents. We brush our teeth in English. In French, we brush the teeth to ourselves. So the reflexive pronoun shows who's doing the action, so we just need a definite article here. Les mains, les cheveux, les dents. In fact, you must never put mes mains or mes cheveux. That sounds wrong in French. So je me lave les mains, il se lave les cheveux, nous nous brossons les dents. So what happens in the negative? Well, the ne goes before the reflexive pronoun and the pas goes after the verb. So it's pretty much what we've been used to, the ne and the pas sandwiching the verb. But this time, we just need to remember that the reflexive pronoun goes before the verb as well. So these mustn't be separated. Je ne me lave pas. So these two stay together, and the ne and the pas. Let me do a little ne and the pas sandwich the verb, but they also sandwich the reflexive pronoun next to the verb. Tu ne te reposes pas, elle ne se lève pas, il ne s'amuse pas, nous ne nous reposons pas, nous ne nous reposons pas, vous ne vous couchez pas, il ne s'ennuie pas. So je ne me lave pas, I don't wash myself. Tu ne te reposes pas, you don't rest. Elle ne se lève pas, she doesn't get up. Il ne s'amuse pas, he doesn't have fun. S'amuser, to have fun. It's a reflexive verb, how about that? Nous ne nous reposons pas, we don't rest. Vous ne vous couchez pas, you don't go to bed. Il ne s'ennuie pas, they don't get bored. S'ennuyer is to get bored. Very interesting that also is a reflexive verb. So, we mentioned before the affirmative imperative, what happens here, because this is a little bit different. And first of all, what is the affirmative imperative? Well, you remember that the imperative is when we give an order. Stand up, sit down, raise your hand. It's giving an order. And the affirmative is yes, positive as opposed to negative. So, in the affirmative imperative, the reflexive pronoun comes after the verb with a hyphen. And the tu form is quite special. Let's have a look. Tu te reposes becomes repose-toi. So you remember, when we're making an imperative, we just take off the subject pronoun. And what we would normally do, we would just simply take off the S in an ER verb, wouldn't we? But we need to put the reflexive verb after the verb. And remember, every time we put something after the verb, we have our little tiret, our little hyphen. So, repose-toi, because te becomes toi, and that's just because to the French, it sounds nicer. Repose-te, that would just sound very odd. So, repose-toi, repose-toi. So that's how we give an order. Rest, literally rest yourself. Yeah? Nous nous reposons, again, we take off the subject pronoun, we move the reflexive pronoun to after the verb, and of course, we must have our little tiret. Reposons-nous, remembering that this is not a subject pronoun, it's a reflexive pronoun. Vous vous couchez, you go to bed. Couchez-vous, because remember, we take off the subject pronoun, we move the reflexive pronoun to after the verb, and we put our little tiret, our hyphen. Couchez-vous, go to bed. You'll be glad to know that in the negative imperative, everything is as normal. So it's only in the affirmative imperative that we make that change. So the pronoun follows the normal rule. So, tu ne te reposes pas, if we make that in order, we simply take off the tu, we take off the e, and it becomes ne te repose pas, without the s. Yeah? Nous ne nous reposons pas. We had the nous here, nous ne nous reposons pas. We just take off that subject pronoun and it's simply ne nous reposons pas. Ne vous couchez pas. As an infinitive, one more thing we need to remember, we must use the appropriate reflexive pronoun. Now we know that reflexive verbs in the infinitive have the se bronzer, s'habiller, s'amuser, se lever, se laver, se brosser. But if we're using it with another subject pronoun, we need to reflect that. Here's an example. Je vais me laver. Now we know when we're talking about the futur proche, it's je vais, we conjugate aller, and we add the infinitive. Yeah? Je vais, infinitive in our little suitcase. Now we know our infinitive is se laver, yes, but because it's je, we need to have the appropriate reflexive pronoun, which of course is me. Je vais me laver, because I'm going to wash myself. I'm not going to wash, you wouldn't say I'm going to wash oneself, I'm going to wash myself. So that's why we don't use se. Tu vas te reposer. Again, with the futur proche, or with any conjugated verb, our next verb here is in the infinitive. We know it's se reposer, but we're not saying you're going to rest oneself. You're going to rest yourself. So even though it's in the infinitive, we have to use the appropriate reflexive pronoun because of tu. Elle aime se bronzer. She likes sunbaking. We know he's our conjugated verb. Our next one must be in the infinitive. Ce is the appropriate reflexive pronoun for elle, so that's fine. Il déteste s'endormir. He hates going to sleep. Again, il déteste. There's our conjugated verb. Next one is in the infinitive, s'endormir, and the appropriate reflexive pronoun for il is ce, which, of course, because it's next to a vowel, becomes S apostrophe. Nous pouvons nous habiller. We can dress ourselves. Lucky us. Nous pouvons nous habiller. Nous pouvons, our conjugated verb. Next one, of course, is in the infinitive. The infinitive is s'habiller, but we're talking about us. Not we can dress oneself or himself. We can dress ourselves. So we must have nous. Vous devez vous lever. You must get up. Vous devez, conjugated verb. Next one is in the infinitive, se lever, but we must use the correct reflexive pronoun vous because we're talking about vous. Ils vont se réveiller. They're going to wake up. Ils vont, conjugated verb. Next one is the infinitive, se réveiller, and the appropriate reflexive pronoun for il is ce. Les verbes réfléchis.